In this video, I'm going to provide a summary of how the first two phases of my UTMB training has gone. So looking at first the build phase and then into the kind of strength phase before now getting more into the specific phase of the UTMB training. Each block has been around 10 weeks. The final two blocks with the specific training, and then the taper will be 7 weeks and 3 weeks respectively. But yeah, so it's been about two 10-week blocks. So I'm going to take you through various reports showing how the training's progressed throughout that time and go into a little bit more detail about the key features of each of those training blocks. So what differentiated the first block, the build phase, to the second phase of training. Overall, you can see from the first report that I'm showing on screen now, this is looking at firstly overall fitness, which is the shaded area, and then fatigue, the pink line, which goes up and down a lot more, and form, the orange line, which is overall a combination of the two elements. And you can see quite clearly when there's been build weeks, build blocks, and then recovery weeks by the fact the fatigue line gets quite high and then drops down in the recovery weeks. So you can see across the training period from the 1st of January this year, there's been an upward trend in fitness, and there has been overall a slight upward trend in fatigue until the very end, which was my last training week. So that was when I went over to Chamonix and did a recce over the 4 days and included 100 odd miles, just over 100 miles over 4 days. That's why there's such a sudden increase in fatigue. And then I had 5 days off, which is why it dropped down quite significantly after that. So that's just a bit of an overview of how the training's gone. Fitness has gone up, which is good to see, and then the fatigue levels have been kept fairly constant as well by having a build and recovery methodology in the training. Now, to achieve that, as I mentioned, there was two different distinct phases in the training plan. There was a build phase, and that was followed by a kind of strength phase, and that was influenced not just the run training but also the strength and conditioning that also went with it. So delving into a little bit more detail, first off, what I'll look at is overall training stress score by week. And again, this is essentially showing the contributing elements which impacted the previous graph of the fitness and the fatigue. And the red line there is showing you the training stress score by week. And again, you can see that the final week that I did, the very high training stress score was obviously that 100 odd mile week that I put in training. Again, the lower elements are the recovery weeks, and there's one or two very low ones there, which were either taper for a race or recovery week after a race. So that's what those very low training stress scores are there. And you can see that overall there's been quite a steady upward trend in the training stress score. Those red columns, as you move from the left to the right, are getting higher each week, and that's just representative of the increase in training load, the number of hours, and also of course the fact that the training has been progressing. It's not just been static, otherwise I would just plateau. So I've had to have new training stimuli in there to make sure that I keep adapting and getting the changes that I'm wanting to achieve for the training. So looking at heart rate first off, this is time in different heart rate zones. The lighter the colour, the lower the heart rate zone. So zone 1 is your very easy type recovery runs, and then the very dark colours are your very, very high intensity kind of maxing out. And as you can see, that there are a lot more time spent in the darker, the higher training zones in the first few weeks, the first build block, than there are in the latter build weeks. Now, the reason for that is down to the fact that the training changed from doing kind of VO2 max, speed work intervals, maybe up to about 3 minutes, to more tempo runs in the latter weeks. So that's why tempo runs would typically be, for me, zone 4 and 5. I use a 7 zone heart rate model, so those tempo runs aren't ever really getting into zone 6 and never into zone 7, whereas I'm doing the harder intervals with a lot of time spent in zone 5 and 6, for example. They're shorter intervals, but overall across the week you can see it's added up to actually more time spent in the upper heart rate zones. And again, that's just getting more specific as we get closer to the race. If I'm running in heart rate zone 6 and 7 at UTMB, something's gone very long unless I'm able to sprint the final 100 metres, which definitely will not be happening. Looking at the elevation gain by week, this is quite an interesting graph as well. I was trying to get up to around 5,000–6,000 metres of elevation per week, and then I've kind of kept it there because I felt that I wasn't able to do much more than that. And then the reason I kind of stopped increasing the weekly volume was just that it was taking me too long to recover. I was just aching the whole time. So again, there's been a steady upward trend. That one outlier is that very last column, which was the week in Chamonix, where technically I started on the Sunday, so some of that 10,000 metres of climbing that I did is actually on the previous column, and then it's about 8,000 odd I did in the final week there. But again, if you drew a line from the furthest left column to the furthest right, it's actually been a very steady trend. That will not continue. It will very much now flatten off. I'm not going to be doing weeks where I am regularly doing 10, 12, 15,000 metres of ascent each week. That it will not be happening, so that will be flattening off. But I hope to see the average there, which is currently on 3,344 metres per week, increasing as we get closer to the race, as I'll be doing more weeks where I'll be getting more ascent than that in each week. Even on my recovery weeks, I'd hope to be doing at least sort of 3,000-4,000 metres of ascent going forward. Similar to the total elevation is the total distance run. This isn't one I look at as much. I actually tend to focus more on time and also elevation for mountain training, but this one again follows quite a similar pattern, I guess unsurprisingly, as the climbing, the elevation one. You can see again that overall there's been an upward trend in the total distance run per week. Obviously there's the odd one which is not quite to plan. There's been a few easier weeks as well, but you can see that overall it has been progressing. And that overall increase in run distance is in part down to the fact that the longest run has also increased. So you can see that the average run that I do is about 20, average long run that I've done has been 25 kilometers. However, a lot of those will be on recovery weeks, and you can see that again there's been a slight upward trend. The reason the one in week 1 on the first week of January is actually quite high and actually higher than the average is because I was living in a flat area then, so a run then was actually a lot further for the same amount of time. That's why that one's actually kind of sticks out on the furthest left. And then again the furthest right, that longest run, was one of the days when I was doing the UTMB recce. I think it's probably about 50 kilometers I did that day, so that was the longest day that I've done on my feet. But that was around 10 hours I think that day, and about 3,000 odd meters of climbing. And I would hope to have a week where I do at least one run longer than that as part of my training in the final, the kind of specific phase of the UTMB training that I'll be going into from now. Looking at the peak pace by distance, this is quite an interesting report when I compare the first quarter, the build block, with the strength element of my training, because you can see that over the shorter distances, the shaded blue area, such as 800 metres and 1 mile, I was running quicker at the start of the year. This isn't really a surprise. I haven't been doing any intervals that short in the second phase of training. That was all very much in the first phase. And then as you can see towards the right of the report, the grey shaded area, I'm actually going quicker over every distance from around 15 kilometres up. And if you look at, say, the 30k difference, that small gap between the blue and the grey shaded area is actually in the region of around 15 to 20 minutes faster over the total distance shown. Obviously in quarter 1 I didn't do any runs over 30 kilometres, that's why there isn't a blue shaded area there, but you can see that my speed over 30k and then up to around the marathon distance has been pretty consistent. There's not much difference there, and I would hope that over time, over the next few weeks, that shaded area, the grey one, will start rising up as I start doing more runs which are slightly quicker over that 30-40 kilometre distance. So that's quite a useful report, just to show how the training focus has shifted from the build phase, where it was a lot of speed work, as you can see the blue line being slightly higher, and then taking that, moving it towards more focused on the longer interval work going forward. The one area where we may see a slight difference in the final phase and a bit of faster speed would be around the 5 kilometre mark, as I start doing specific intervals where I'll be pushing around 25 to 30 minutes, so I'll be easily covering 5 minutes in an individual interval as part of a training session as a steady state run. Now that's not going flat out, it's nowhere near 5k race pace, however there could be some changes there where I start pushing up that bit, and then that may result in overall, say, a 10k or 15k run will have a larger percentage of time spent running at an interval pace. Although it's a slower interval, there'll be more time spent running at that pace. Those are just some of the reports that I use to track my training, and also helps influence what future workouts will look like. As I mentioned, there was the element where I've reduced the amount of climbing. I've stopped increasing it week on week because I was finding it was just taking too long to recover. And actually I may start adopting a kind of 1 week on, 1 week off approach as I get into this very specific UTMB training, as if I want to do a very big build week, then I have to have a easy week after, rather than doing, say, a 2 build week or a 3 build week program as I did before. But that's something I'll be tracking, not just on how I feel. I also use a heart rate variability measure as well, which can provide very useful insight as to how well I'm recovering. And then also just in general how I actually feel overall. Are my legs hurting? If so, I should be listening to my body and then responding to that. Looking forward at the next phase of training, I say it'll be around 7 weeks, and it will be moving from kind of the strength phase into more of the specific phase for UTMB, and that will include a couple of new workouts, looking at increasing my hill climbing speed, so doing some specific hill speed work, moving also to steady state runs, so away from the tempo runs but to steady state runs, and I'll do individual videos on both of those specific workouts. And the steady state runs are really focusing on building my speed endurance over a longer duration. So whereas the tempo runs were working at kind of just below or around lactate threshold, these are below lactate threshold level. And they serve a really good purpose as it helps as they build speed endurance, and I'll move them from doing it on, say, a flatter track as we progress through the weeks, but onto more trails, so undulating and replicating race conditions more and more frequently as my training progresses. The long runs will probably increase slightly in duration as well, and I'm going to try and do another back-to-back long run. So I did 4 days round UTMB on the course, as I mentioned, but then I'm also going to do at least one other sort of back-to-back long runs, just as a bit of shock again to the body, and that will probably be a one-off big build week followed by a recovery week. The other element that will be changing is the strength and conditioning, so I'll be moving from the strength element of that to the power phase, as I call it, so more explosive exercises. That won't be a set change all happening on the same day at the end of the recovery week, but what will happen is I'll slowly introduce these new elements, so I'm not having a massive change in my training all at the one time. So for example, the strength and conditioning, I'll carry on doing the strength for at least 1 more week before I introduce the power phase, and then ultimately all of those elements will come together for the final few build weeks before I move on to the taper. If you've enjoyed this video, please make sure you like and share it, and please subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss out on any future content. As I mentioned, I will be doing some specific videos on the next phase of my training, looking at the steady state runs and the hill repeats, and go into more detail around the benefits around those 2 individual workouts. And also I'm going to have more UTMB specific content as well coming up on the channel as it gets closer to the race day. I'll see you next time.